Hello and welcome to Dean and Ben Talk Tech episode 8. Is it 8, Dean?
Yeah, number 8. We're doing well.
That's not bad.
Digits. Yeah.
Yeah, good. Hi, Dean. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Yeah, I'm pretty busy. Yourself?
Yeah, well, quite busy as well. I had a bit of a break, so nice and refreshed now, which is good. So you were in the US a lot lately.
Yeah, I've had a couple of trips, and in fact, I'm going back again next week. But I'm particular. A couple of weeks ago, I was at the Wi-Fi Now Congress in Mountain View in California, which is always a fantastic venue called the Computer History Museum, which is interesting as a visit in its own right. But it's a good place for conferences. And that was over 3 days. The first day was looking at sort of a long-range version of Wi-Fi called Halo and another wireless technology called UWB. Both interesting. Halo is important for some IoT use cases and was more advanced than I'd expected. But the 2 main days were focusing on sort of Wi-Fi in both enterprise and residential settings. Probably the big story which was being pitched by many of the speakers was looking forward to the next generation of Wi-Fi 8. Now, Wi-Fi cycles arrive much faster than mobile cycles, so we're only just starting to deploy Wi-Fi 7. And the standards for Wi-Fi 8 are being formulated, but there's some early sort of pre-standard chipsets. And some people thinking that actually it's all iterating too quickly. But the interesting thing for me was the argument that Wi-Fi 8 is not about maximum speed, but it's essentially being, well, they didn't use the phrase AI native, as that's very associated with the mobile industry, but what they're pitching Wi-Fi 8 is Wi-Fi for AI, both Wi-Fi for AI and AI for Wi-Fi. And it's a bit of a similar story to what I've seen elsewhere, but it's actually a bit more, in some ways, more compelling. I think that the Wi-Fi, the AI for Wi-Fi, in terms of improvement of design and planning, performance, things like beamforming, there's a lot of sort of clever stuff that's going into the standard to optimize for low, not just low, but deterministic latency and reliability. And some of that's AI driven, some of it's more sort of guts of the radio. But it's interesting that they're very much pivoting the technology to be more predictable and reliable, even in congested settings, which I thought was important. The other side to this is putting Wi-Fi use for AI workloads. Now, some of this I didn't believe. There's an awful lot of talk about, AI is going to need ultra low latency. I'm like, well, really? I mean, if I run a query on ChatGPT, it could take 30 minutes. I'm coding. A lot of the value in AI is for things like coding, which might run again for hours or overnight. So the
half second of expressing that to the network is not where you're going to challenge.
Exactly. Exactly. So I think that there's a sort of, and I see this across telecoms. There's this sort of automatic, like AI is growing, therefore access network, therefore low latency is essential. And I think there's a few missing pieces of that argument for certain things. In terms of the internal processes, if you're doing reasoning, if you're doing training, it's in microseconds to get data from the memory to the GPU training cluster, whatever. Sure. But on the access network, I don't think it's necessarily for chatbots or whatever. A lot of this is like projecting that we're going to use AI for augmented reality and real-time analytics of video, which is true on a factory production line, but for sort of someone doing TikTok videos or something like that, it's milliseconds don't matter.
Also, even in private networks, there's a cost to doing ultra low latency in terms of spectrum allocation and all that, which means that you don't want to have that as a default setup, because then you're maximizing your cost all the time. So you're only going to really dedicate those resources to applications that absolutely need it. Absolutely. But having said that, I can see that there's certainly in the B2B space, there is a push and pull there, where Wi-Fi does not want to be displaced by mobile private networks everywhere. So they do have to ensure that they can handle these, very specific applications.
Yeah, certainly on the enterprise side, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The interesting one for me, though, for the residential Wi-Fi, is the smarts you can put into a home gateway or router, which allows you to do stuff not so much low latency, but higher privacy. And if you can localize stuff like monitoring your security cameras, or potentially doing motion detection, running other applications on the home gateway, potentially with a fair amount of privacy, we can debate whether the service provider is involved or not, then as well as latency, it's more on-prem, and also from the service provider's point of view, it's your electricity bill, not theirs.
Yeah, of course. So the other thing I wanted to ask you about is, because last time we spoke about some of the seemingly a little strange US policy announcements, which I imagine, since they concern home routers, would be discussed at such an event.
It was quieter about it than you might have expected, probably because there's a lot of discussions behind the scenes. The FCC didn't send someone to the event, which they have done at various previous ones. So there's clearly, let's say, a vibrant debate. What I did pick out was a couple of the component suppliers, and people doing radio chips and things like this, were very much had a Stars and Stripes Made in the USA banner. So there's already a sort of interest in what does it take to make all this stuff domestically. There's been, as far as I know, 3 waivers issued, 2 of which came out during the show. So Adtran, Netgear, and now also Amazon Eero have been given waivers, at least until next year. So there's clearly a process behind this, and I saw the FCC now has an FAQ up on their website of what does all this mean. So, for example, it doesn't cover the hotspot function in your phone. It doesn't cover enterprise Wi-Fi, which has generally been a bit more cybersec checked and verified. It doesn't cover critical software updates. They've actually obviously had quite a lot of pushback on this. A lot going on behind the scenes. What there's also was a little bit of an undercurrent about, though, that the FCC is also still looking on the spectrum side about, you've got the CTIA starting to come out again, along with GSMA saying, oh, maybe you need to have another look at 6 gigahertz unlicensed spectrum. I've got some stuff I've written where actually 6 gig is being used by Wi-Fi already, including the upper part of the band. And there was also, surprisingly, something which actually got kicked out, which is on the sub 1 gigahertz, the 900 megahertz section used by this technology, Halo, and also things like LoRa and other low power IoT networks. There was a desire, by a company called NextNav, to use that for high power 5G, which would have killed a big chunk of the IoT industry, including stuff used by utilities and critical infrastructure. So that's been kicked out by, I'm not sure it was the FCC or one of the courts that kicked it out. But that sub 1 gigahertz is really important for lots of uses, including broadcast and microphones and bits of 5G and future 6G. But it's good that at least that wasn't something that suddenly got thrown into the we need to find spectrum to auction grinding machine in the US.
Okay, good. Well, while you were in the US, I was in London for the Fibre to Home Council event. I have to say, I'm not entirely sure why yet, but I have to say it felt like it was a lot quieter than some of the previous iterations. It could be in part due to the venue, because XL is such a vast place that, even significant events may seem a bit smaller in proportion to, the size of the venue. But I do think there was a bit of a question mark around where the industry is going, because if you think about it, in Europe, there's a number of markets now where access upgrade is, virtually done. We're talking about the last maybe 5% of homes, which in volume is going to be insignificant in light of what was done before. And there are countries where the growth is just not happening, in large part because the key market players are not keen to invest all that much. And so I think part of the industry is really questioning how they keep their revenues at the level they currently are, let alone increase them. And I think there's a number of paths there, but none of them super simple. So obviously the most obvious path is, well, XGS-PON, which is the 10 gig symmetrical PON, is now more or less industry standard, which doesn't mean it's being deployed everywhere, but it means if anyone is deploying now, they're deploying XGS-PON natively, and any upgrade cycles happening would go from the legacy GPON to XGS-PON. But the next wave is either 25G, which is kind of what Nokia pushes for, or 50G, which is what kind of the Chinese vendors and a few others push for. But I have some doubts as to the significance of that change in the next few years, simply because it seems to me that in light of overall internet traffic slowing down its growth to a point where we can now more or less anticipate it being flat by the end of the decade, is there really going to be demand for super high speeds going forward? So this is kind of a parallel with the point you were making about Wi-Fi now focusing on reliability and other metric and aspects of what a good quality of experience may be. So that's one path, but I think it's not going to drive the levels of revenue that we've seen in the industry previously. Another path would be, at least for the vendors, would be expansion outside of Europe. So leveraging the know-how in markets, that are still where things are still to happen. But if you look at that kind of coldly, it's going to be primarily developing markets, and for European players it's probably going to be primarily Africa, and a few of these players are already positioned in Africa, and I'm not sure that the market dynamics there are at the level yet where it could sustain a substitution of revenue from Europe to Africa.
Yeah, presumably it's going to have to be some countries in Africa, or like I could imagine sort of Morocco, maybe parts of Egypt, and a few others.
I think obviously South Africa, Kenya, maybe Nigeria to some extent, but it is going to be much more patchy, and certainly the prospect of universal coverage or something approaching universal coverage is definitely not on the cards. And then there's a third path, which I think is a really interesting one, but it's one that the industry has been struggling with for a while now, which is optical LAN. So, ironically, fiber in the access is now a given, even if it hasn't been deployed everywhere. But inside businesses, we're still relying on copper everywhere. And optical solutions are actually very effective and cost-effective, much more so than your legacy Ethernet stuff. And the volume of business that could be derived from that is actually enormous. It's really, really huge. The problem is this is a market that Cisco has preempted, and for the last 35 years or even more, this is all Cisco. And so no one has managed to really go head to head with Cisco and build the kind of distribution network that Cisco has, which is one of their great assets. And so, basically, if a company gets to a point where they say, okay, our Cat 5 is now insufficient for our needs, well, they're just going to deploy Cat 6 instead of looking at alternative solutions that might be, longer lasting, less energy demanding, all of the stuff that optical fiber could deliver. So I think there's a big question mark there, which is, I'm sure there is a big opportunity but I'm not sure the industry has sussed out ways of actually leveraging that.
Yeah, no, I mean it's a tough one. I mean, you've obviously got incumbents, whether it's Cisco or HPE or Extreme, and there's a list of other ones. And it's the issue is that ultimately it's still Ethernet, and there's a big link to the channel, to skills. There's millions of people who know how to put Cat 5 or Cat 6 or whatever cabling in a tray and around a building. The number of fibre installers is smaller. You've got more dependencies on the connectors. It's I mean, obviously, you've got areas where it's essential, and so I mean, to be honest, if you're talking about copper replacement, where it is starting to happen is in the data center of co-packaged optics between. Rather than pluggables, and that's there's massive shifts in terms of investors at the moment. But the use case there is, actually terabit level networking between GPU clusters and high bandwidth memory and all the rest of it. Now, maybe over time, what we will see, the same way that the sort of enterprise and data center LAN eventually filtered down to smaller businesses, maybe you'll see the optical and photonics side of it go from hyperscale data centers downstream. I'm not sure whether the grassroots, you want to sort of connect your PC to the printer stuff at an enterprise level is going to start with optical connectivity and stringing fibre around the office for any time soon. I think it's going to filter down rather than filter up.
Well, I think there's kind of some use cases are obviously more compelling than others. So, the hospitality industry, hospitals. There's I think there are fragments of the market where the business case is easier to make. The question becomes how centralized can those decisions be? So, I have no idea how many hotels there are in Europe, but it's a huge market potentially if you were to, sign up a deal to refurbish even a tenth of those. But the question is, actually practically, how do you do that? How do you make that happen? The other angle is the real estate angle, I think, where essentially if you look at this from the point of view of real estate managers as opposed to the companies that might be actually, leasing or renting the space, there are other considerations. So, for example, when each new generation of Ethernet is deployed, the cable of the previous generation stays in place. It's not used, but it stays in place. So there's actually a very significant weight of copper cabling in the false ceilings of most buildings, and in some places, this has started to become an issue because it's a weight bearing on the entire structure that's actually not negligible. So there may be other incentives for real estate to say, okay, we need to be modernizing from that point of view. The other thing, of course, is there is some space to be gained from passive optical deployment because you don't need active routers on each floor. You don't need cold rooms.
There is a problem though, which is one of the nice things about copper Ethernet is you can do power over Ethernet.
Yeah.
So you can actually power the endpoints like Wi-Fi routers or
absolutely.
Cells.
You're right.
Whereas
You're right.
essentially, if you put optics in it, it may just mean you need to put more electrical outlets and electrical wiring.
So I mean, I don't want to overstate the case because all I've seen is business cases pushed by vendors who obviously have a vested interest in showing these business cases are positive. However, at the event, I did have the opportunity to speak to a few companies, and they seem to think that it was mostly beneficial. So there are some trade-offs for sure. I do think that the overall case is good. The problem is more one of distribution and go-to-market, basically. How do you make that happen en masse? And I think it's a very interesting challenge to be had, but it is a challenge.
So one question I've got for you, in terms of, I mean, I would have liked to have gone to the FTTH event myself, especially since it was in London, but I was away that week. What was your sense in terms of uptake and trends in converting, properties past, whether it's sort of residential or MDUs or enterprise, to actually using, fibre? Because I know some markets it's a done deal, but others like the UK, it's sort of fairly grindingly slow to actually get people to switch.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we have discussed this in the past, and essentially, in markets where fiber to the cabinet was rolled out quite effectively, they're all struggling with fiber to home take up, simply because, whereas in France and Spain, your arbitration as a client was, do I want to stay on my 10 megabit DSL, or do I want a gigabit fiber for the same price or a slightly marginally higher price? That's a relatively easy decision to make. Whereas if you have 100 or even 200, as is sometimes the case in Germany because they've got bonded pairs of copper, FTTC, then your gigabit at the same price or higher, it doesn't look very appealing. So it's much harder to transition customers over to fiber in those markets. Now, the trends have been accelerating slightly, but it's not massive. And this is where one of the topics that keeps coming back that does irritate me is, looking at copper switch off as the silver bullet to that equation, which I think is completely absurd because the timing is entirely wrong. Right? If your investor is unhappy with your lackluster take up now, they're not going to wait 10 years for copper switch off to happen. I'm going to come back to this, if you're okay, at the end of the session, because I'm talking to various potential clients about a solution that we want to offer. But what I would say is the following. I think that the topic of take-up is really down to commercial strategies by the various players who have deployed fiber. And I think by and large there's been in the last 10 years an overarching focus on deployment as opposed to selling. And so I think not 100%, but a lot of the potential solutions there are going to be about operators doing the right thing from a commercial standpoint and actually taking the topic seriously as opposed to kicking that can down the road or just putting their hands up in the air and saying, well, people are not interested. I think it's a commercial challenge more than anything.
Yeah, no, I mean, I certainly see that when the people I've spoken to, there's obviously been a sort of, I think they probably pushed down on the build pedal for a bit too long and didn't switch into product. Particularly not just sort of sales and marketing, but actually thinking about products and bundling and all of that stuff. And actual service creation and innovation, and particularly in markets where there's a lot of competition.
Well, what I would add to that, and I agree with that, but what I would add to that is also that I don't think it's something that obviously you have to have some built in order to have something to sell. But the best time to sell is actually when you've just built, because people know you're there because you've been, digging their streets and your vans have been visible and all of this. And doing that and then waiting 3 years to start commercialization on the dubious, justification that you're not at scale, I think is a big mistake. You actually need to be selling the minute that you're ready for service. And obviously, when you're 10 years late on that, that's not going to be a solution. But I think it's a big part of the problem.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that. A couple of things. So last week was pretty busy for me. There was FutureNet in London for a couple of days, which I attended, and I moderated a panel on APIs. And then I had my own Unthinkable Lab on sovereignty, or what it means for telecoms. The two sort of there was a fairly strong overlap. So I'd say the FutureNet's a fantastic event. They've run in London for a few years, and I think there's a couple of others in New York and one in Asia or Middle East now as well. And it's essentially the main focus is on automation for telcos, particularly sort of OSS and to a degree BSS, so the back office systems, and also sort of historically the NFV and managing the network virtualization parts. And over time, it's absorbed a bit more stuff on the radio network and the fixed access network and AI and APIs. I would say the last week was probably went a little bit back to its roots on automation. There was a lot of discussion about where are we with quite autonomous networks, and the TM forum has got a scale that matches autonomous vehicles. So there's a lot of people saying, are we at level 4, which means you essentially have human sort of administering the loop. There's various on the loop, in the loop. I'm not going to go through the details of it. And the general story is it's progressing. There's a bit of wariness of doing full lights out automation because of concerns over essentially sort of risk and proof points before you completely let the robots run the network. But certainly on greenfield networks, there's more interest there. Certainly on the deployment side of it, companies like Rakuten Symphony, which have been advocating that for a while. There was probably much less talk of the we'll let AI run the network and then use any spare horsepower to run customer workloads. That was much less of an emphasis than I might have thought. Nvidia wasn't the sponsor. There were booths from I think AMD chip manufacturers there. Also Broadcom, but that's probably Broadcom wearing its VMware virtualization hat rather than the silicon side. What I thought was interesting was probably the first panel of CIOs and other C-levels talking about AI and networks, and they basically said we're not seeing any growth in uplink traffic worth noting yet, maybe a small amount of growth from a small base. We're interested in edge compute, but more for reasons of sovereignty and offering sovereign services rather than the usual sort of AI latency, robotics, physical AI stuff. They're watching it, but it's not there happening yet. And the importance is for telcos doing AI internally. If they want to have an external AI services play, there's a bit of a move towards setting up separate what are called AI factories, almost as like a sort of a development house in parallel, rather than sort of thinking about reusing the same infrastructure. And that to me makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's hard enough for operators to deploy AI to improve their network build and operation without thinking about, am I putting the right resources in place with developer tools and support and all the rest of it, for customer workloads. And I think separating those two out, I think makes a lot of sense to me. So I thought the FutureNet was very interesting. I ran a panel on network APIs, which was much more in the background this year. It's been going on for 2-3 years. We've got anti-fraud APIs. We're still quite slow on getting the hard network APIs of quality on demand. They're popping up in little places, but it wasn't an emphasis at all for the overall show beyond my panel, I think. And then there was also one very interesting panel, which I wrote a LinkedIn post about 5G standalone, and the fact that some operators are still SA skeptic, basically saying, if we were on a €10 ARPU, we're not sure we can squeeze any more new services, even with the fancy features from standalone. So is it worth it? And I thought that was a bit of a wake-up call, whereas you've got some operators that are very much, 5G standalone is real 5G, it's fundamental to everything we're doing, it's a foundation for 6G in the future, whereas others are like, well, show me the money. And then lastly, I ran last Thursday the fifth in the series of my Unthinkable Lab workshops, which are small groups, 20-30 people. I run them with another colleague of mine, Andrew Collinson, supported by Telecom TV. And this was about what does sovereignty mean for telecoms. I wrote an update post. It was a very interesting day. Some of the details are under Chatham House rule. We'll write up a summary report. So I think next time we do a podcast, I'll refer to the report when it's published and give a link. I'm not going to rehash it all right now. There was a lot of insight, and sovereignty for telcos is different to the big picture digital sovereignty.
No, absolutely.
The politicians, because when politicians talk about tech sovereignty, 90% of it is about cloud, AI, and chips.
Yeah.
And networks are sort of assumed. And it's a bit more
No, I
subtle
agree.
than that.
I agree. Okay.
Right. Good.
Okay.
What's next?
Well, I said that I would talk about take-up quickly at the end. Basically, I've been working with a company called Point Topic that specializes in geographical data, and we are basically soft launching a solution that we call the take-up acceleration engine, which is essentially a kind of first layer of mapping of customers' internal data in a way that will make actioning the take-up issues much easier. So understanding where your low-hanging fruit are, which marketing or commercial approaches have worked, but also figuring out which factors might affect your take-up in ways that you don't expect. And sometimes it's external stuff like demographics or various elements related to the customers themselves, but sometimes it's also internal stuff like who your subcontractors are, which technology you've deployed, stuff that you wouldn't think has an impact, but actually once measured shows that there are impacts. And so that's my big push for the next few months, and hopefully we'll have stuff that we can show maybe in one of our future podcasts.
Excellent, great. And I'll be in the States again next week at ConnectX, which is a sort of TowerCo and 5G and fixed wireless and a bit of Wi-Fi event. And then I'll be at the Canadian Telecoms Summit the week after in Toronto. So I'm quite curious, because I sort of dipped in and out of the Canadian telecom market, and it's a bit of a separate world, particularly given sovereignty issues at the moment. So I'll report back on that next time.
Excellent. All right.
Excellent. All right.
Well, this was fun. Speak to you soon, Dean. And remember, people, if you like this, like, subscribe, share, and remember that we're available on all types of platforms, audio and video.
And in person as well.
Absolutely.
Excellent.
All right.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
Bye, Dean.
Bye. Bye.